Stefan's isolation on that balcony perfectly encapsulates the socio-historical trap. He is caught exactly between the twin chasms, propaganda and frivolity. Let's dissect the first chasm, which he experienced in East Berlin. Socialist realism. This is state-sponsored propaganda masquerading as art. Historically, under doctrines like Zionism and the Soviet bloc, the state dictates an aesthetic of totality and conflict. Socialist realism claims to depict objective reality, but it operates entirely on an a priori judgment. It starts with a predetermined dogmatic conclusion about what reality must be according to Marxist-Leninist doctrine. Because the state's ideology dictates that the socialist system is perfect and moving toward utopia, any art that reflects sadness, failure, or starvation contradicts the doctrine. Therefore, the artist is forced to eliminate anything that conflicts with the state's vision of the future.
The state essentially gaslights the artist's reality. Stefan's mother actually died of malnutrition. That was the concrete reality of his suffering. But according to the commissars, because starvation cannot exist in a perfect socialist state, his grief is not real, it is merely a bourgeois illusion. The art is forced to serve a fictional utopia rather than the painful truth of the present.
It forces the artwork to operate as an implicit problem novel, where the solution to the human condition is already aggressively written before the first chord is even struck. The artist is drafted into the state apparatus, expected to act as an engineer of human souls, manufacturing consent and optimism. It destroys rebellion by making the artist an agent of the oppressor.
And what about the second chasm?
Now, consider the second chasm, which Stefan confronts, the culture industry. To analyze this, we looked at the critical theory developed by thinkers like Theodor Adorno and the Frankfurt School.
Right, Adorno.
Adorno relentlessly analyzed how advanced capitalist societies develop a massive culture industry that treats art merely as another commodity to be mass-produced and consumed.
On my way.
The commercial machine functions by standardization and pseudo-individualization. It flattens the inherently disruptive, rebellious nature of art into comfortable, safe entertainment.
So the slick entrepreneur in Paris doesn't want to suppress Stefan's trauma. He wants to exploit it. But he needs to defang it first. He wants to package the trauma in a way that provides the audience with a thrilling, emotional story without actually challenging their comfortable bourgeois worldview or forcing them to confront the real mechanics of suffering.
The culture industry turns rebellion into a lifestyle aesthetic. It drains the revolutionary potential out of the work by commodifying it. When trauma is transformed into a brand, it is subjected to the logic of the market, which demands easy consumption. It reduces art to formal escapism or frivolity.
It's just background noise for a cocktail party.
Exactly. Stefan recognizes that both the communist commissar and the capitalist merchant share the exact same underlying goal. They are both trying to eliminate the true tension of art. The commissar wants to draft the artist into an ideological army to march in lockstep. The merchant wants to buy the artist, declaw them, and keep them as an exotic pet for entertainment.
So the trap is total. If he yields to the East, he lies about reality to serve the state. If he yields to the West, he sells his trauma as a cheap commodity. How does an artist survive this golden cage? Where is the space for genuine creation?
The space is maintained entirely by refusing to surrender to either force. Stefan's realization on that balcony that true rebellion meant continuing to play his music while living permanently in the painful, unvarnished friction between those two worlds is the ultimate expression of the Camusian ideal.
So you just have to endure the friction.
The artist must simultaneously and aggressively reject the frenzy of ideological annihilation and the passive acceptance of commercial totality. True art remains the supreme act of rebellion only if it stubbornly maintains its fierce independence. It refuses to serve as a megaphone for the state's propaganda, and it refuses to be hollowed out into background noise by the market.
It has to stay true to the suffering.
Yes, it stays rigorously true to the concrete, bleeding reality of human suffering, while insisting, against all odds, on the human capacity to create beauty out of that very suffering.
The theoretical architecture here is incredibly intricate, but analyzing theory is different from executing it. The ultimate test of chemists' philosophy of rebellion, stylization, and the rejection of both propaganda and abstraction is how he applied these massive concepts to his own creative masterwork.
Totally, the novel The Plague.
The Plague serves as the perfect crucible for testing whether this aesthetic theory actually holds together under pressure. Let's look at the physical setting Camus constructs. He places the narrative in the beleaguered North African coastal city of Iran. The city is suddenly violently struck by an outbreak of bubonic plague.
Yeah, everything shuts down.
The authorities hesitate, then slam the gates shut. The city is totally quarantined. Citizens are trapped inside, completely cut off from the outside world. Telegrams and radio messages beam in from families on the outside offering empty platitudes. Food supplies dwindle and strict rationing is enforced. Armed guards patrol the gates with orders to shoot anyone attempting to flee.
It's a total lockdown of a society.
Desperate sanitary squads are organized by the citizens to fight the invisible disease. As the death toll mounts, mass graves are dug, quarantine concentration camps are erected in the stadium, and eventually a crematorium operates through the night, billowing thick smoke over the silent town.
Yeah, the parallels there are not subtle at all.
No. The imagery intensely and vividly evokes the reality of the Nazi occupation. The closed, suffocating city, the rationing, the underground resistance squads, the isolation, the crematoriums, it maps directly onto the historical trauma of the 1940s.
But this choice of setting invites a severe critical challenge.
Right, because Camus was deeply physically involved in the actual French resistance. He lived the reality of clandestine meetings, the fear of the Gestapo, the moral weight of armed conflict. So why filter this profound historical experience through the lens of a biological plague?
The question a lot of people ask is,
why not write a gritty, hyper-realistic historical novel detailing the exact political realities of the French resistance? Writing a fable about a disease seems, on the surface, like a dodge. A biological virus does not possess a political ideology. A virus does not choose to be evil. Doesn't substituting a disease for the Gestapo act as a form of escapism? Doesn't it allow the author to completely sidestep the complex, muddy, excruciating moral realities of war, like the ethics of shooting civilian hostages, assassinating enemy officers, or the deeply political nature of collaboration?
That exact challenge was levied against Camus fiercely by his contemporaries, notably by figures aligned with Sartre. They accused Camus of constructing a Red Cross morality.
A Red Cross morality, meaning what? Like it's too sanitized?
They argue that by comparing the deliberate, systematic evil of fascism to a natural, blameless disaster like a biological outbreak, Camus was stripping the political context from the suffering. They accused him of making oppression seem like a force of nature rather than a deliberate human choice that must be fought with political violence.
That sounds like a pretty devastating critique.
It does. But this criticism fundamentally misunderstands the sophisticated literary mechanics operating within the plague. Camus is not writing a simple historical retelling, nor is he writing a basic one-dimensional allegory. He is utilizing a much older, highly complex structural style that medieval literary scholars, most notably Eric Auerbach, identified as figural realism, often referred to as the Dantean figura.
Figural realism. Okay, so that requires a distinct separation from standard allegory. When dealing with standard allegory like George Orwell's Animal Farm, the mechanics are purposefully transparent. It operates as a neat mathematical equation.
A equals B.
The pigs equal the Bolshevik leadership, the farmer equals the Tsar, the windmill equals Soviet industrialization. The characters are essentially neat, sterile abstractions wearing costumes to deliver a specific political critique. A equals B, and once you solve the equation, the text holds no further mystery.
Standard allegory is structurally closed. On the other hand, if Camus had written a purely historical, journalistic account of the French resistance, it would have been a surrender to the raw, unstylized material of reality.
Just indefinite enumeration again.
A hyper-realistic novel would limit his philosophical vision to a very specific, localized time and place, France, between 1940 and 1944. It would be a historical document, but it wouldn't necessarily speak to the universal mechanics of suffering.
So figural realism is the middle ground.
Figural realism is the architectural bridge between these two extremes. To understand how it works, you look at how it was utilized in classical biblical exegesis, or by Dante Alighieri in the Divine Comedy. In the figural structure, an event or a person is presented as entirely real, concrete, and grounded in history, but its reality simultaneously points toward and prefigures a greater universal truth that encompasses it.
In Dante's Inferno, when he meets characters like Farinata in Hell, those figures are deeply, stubbornly rooted in the specific violent, historical, and political realities of 13th century Florence. They are not abstract stand-ins for pride or anger. They are vividly real people suffering in a specific way. Yet the nature of their punishment and the state of their soul in the narrative signifies eternal moral truths about the human condition. They managed to be relentlessly specific to their time while being universally representative of human failing.
And that dual nature is the engine of the plague. The outbreak in Iran is not presented as a fairy tale. It is written with overwhelming, clinical, naturalistic concreteness. It would describe the sweating intervals, the exact temperature of the fever, the smell of the disinfectant, the bureaucratic exhaustion of the doctor.
You can practically smell it.
It is a physical, undeniable reality within the world of the novel, but it functions structurally as a figure that prefigures and points to a timeless truth. By stylizing the specific historical horror of the Nazi occupation into the biological reality of a plague, Camus executes a profound philosophical maneuver. He elevates a localized historical event into a permanent statement about the human condition.
What statement is that?
The experience of the war taught Camus a bitter lesson. Exile, arbitrary suffering, profound separation, and the struggle against invisible forces are not just temporary political inconveniences that can be permanently eradicated by signing a treaty. They are the permanent, inescapable essentials of human existence.
Ow. So reading the plague merely as a stand-in for fascism is a failure of scale. Fascism is not the entirety of the plague. Fascism is simply one specific historical outbreak of a much deeper, older infection.
Precisely the point of the figural structure. Evil is not a temporary political intrusion that a society can permanently defeat in a single glorious revolution or war. Evil, suffering, and the absurd act as a permanent microbe in the human environment.
It's always there.
If Camus had written a strictly realistic novel about the French Resistance, the narrative arc would dictate that the evil ends when the Allied peace war ends. The aggressors are defeated, the book closes, and the problem is historically solved.
But the problem isn't solved.
No. But by using the figure of the plague bacillus, Camus creates a sprawling, haunting image that connects an isolated historical trauma to the enduring moral condition of humanity. He forces the realization that the underlying mechanism of oppression and suffering is never permanently eradicated. The victory is always temporary.
The scope of this is immense. Whether we are looking at the abstract painter in the gallery, realizing his art is inextricably dependent on the chaotic street protest outside, or Vivienne in her dark room desperately finding the exact framing to process trauma without erasing it, or Stefan standing on his balcony refusing to let his grief be consumed by propaganda or commercialism, the act of true creation and the act of rebellion itself is always characterized by this acute, unrelenting, exhausting tension.
It is a perpetual balancing act over an abyss. It demands an unwavering, agonizing commitment to the concrete realities of human suffering, balanced entirely by a rigorous, defiant refusal to let that suffering extinguish the human spirit. Human beings are trapped in a profound, inescapable dialectic. The irrationality of the universe imposes severe limits on human rationality, but that very recognition of limits gives human action its moderation and its dignity. Out of sheer, suffocating meaninglessness, humanity is the plague bacillus never truly dies or disappears. It lies dormant in the furniture and the linens, waiting patiently to rouse its rats and send them forth to die in a happy city. True artistic rebellion is the perpetual, exhausting, yet beautiful vigilance against that reawakening. And since we cannot always give history a definitive meaning, we can stubbornly ensure that our own lives and our creations exist.
Can't take many more hits like that. Damage is light. That got through my armor, Commander.
Last week I was actually having coffee with a friend of mine, Jonas. He lives over in Berlin.
Oh, nice city.
Yeah, it's great. And he shares this really beautiful, light-filled apartment with his girlfriend of 4 years.
Right, so they're pretty established.
Exactly. They both work these very stable corporate jobs. But, you know, when the conversation naturally drifted toward the future and having children, Jonas just launched into this passionate, almost clinical critique of the modern economy.
Let me guess. Housing costs.
You nailed it. He kept waving his hands, getting genuinely worked up about skyrocketing housing costs, stagnant wages, and how the system, as he put it, makes parenting mathematically impossible.
I mean, we hear that argument all the time. The ledger sheets just don't add up.
Right. And to hear him tell it, he deeply wanted a family. The math just, you know, into the paradox I have recently been looking into.
Okay.
I pointed out that Germany already offers some of the most robust parental leave and child subsidies in the entire world.
They really do. It's a massive safety net.
Yeah. And unlike young adults in places like Italy, where 90% of people his age are financially stuck living in their childhood bedrooms.
Which is a whole other crisis.
Totally. But Jonas and his partner already had the independent space and the security that most couples dream. So I just looked at him and asked, if the state covered every single cost tomorrow, would you two have a baby?
Oh, wow. That is a direct question. What did he say?
The moment the question left my mouth, his entire demeanor just shifted. Like the righteous economic anger instantly vanished, and it was replaced by this really uncomfortable, heavy silence. He stared down at his phone, kind of fidgeted with his coffee cup, and finally mumbled, well, a kid is just a massive permanent lock-in. I don't know if we are ready to be tied down to one trajectory forever.
Wow. That is quite a pivot.
Right. That sudden pivot from blaming global macroeconomic forces to exposing this deep-seated fear of permanent commitment, it just left me fascinated.
Because it completely changes the narrative.
Exactly. It made me realize that his financial complaints weren't the actual failure. They were basically a respectable shield hiding a much deeper vulnerability.
A socially acceptable excuse.
And it's a contradiction that is quietly playing out in millions of households across the globe, you know? It suggests that the empty cradles of our generation aren't actually a crisis of need at all. A crisis of an unspoken crisis of intimacy, exactly. And what you are witnessing here, and what Jonas's reaction completely shatters, is the illusion that simply fixing housing policy or injecting capital into the system will magically fill the nurseries.
Yeah, we are completely trapped in this loop of economic determinism.
We constantly argue over tax credits and mortgage rates, basically treating the absence of children as a pure math problem, but we are ignoring the true bottleneck. The actual bottleneck is the collapse of couple formation itself.
It is remarkable how deeply entrenched that economic loop is in the collective psyche. I mean, to understand why we always default to blaming the ledger sheets, we have to look back at how we've been trained to view human behavior.
Right, because this didn't come out of nowhere.
Exactly. For the better part of the last 60 years, the absolute gold standard for analyzing birth rates has been this economic framework called economics.
New home economics, okay.
Yeah, it was pioneered back in 1960 by an economist named Gary Becker. And his core premise is, well, it's so clinical that it almost sounds like satire today. He essentially posited that children should be viewed and analyzed as consumer durables.
Wait, consumer durable?
I know, it's a harsh term.
When I hear consumer durable, I think of like a refrigerator or a washing machine or a car. Are you saying the foundational model genuinely treats a human child the same way a consumer treats buying an appliance?
That is the exact mathematical framework. The Beckerian model assumes that human beings are just perfectly rational economic actors operating in a marketplace.
That is incredibly
genius. In this framework, bringing a child into the world requires a massive, sustained investment of two finite resources, which are time and money.
Right, the basic inputs.
Exactly. So according to the theory, as societies modernize and industrialize, the opportunity cost of time rises dramatically.
Because people could be working this way.
Right, particularly as highly educated women began entering the workforce in large numbers. An hour spent raising a child is an hour not spent earning a wage or advancing a career.
Which makes sense on a spreadsheet, I guess.
Sure. You pair that rising opportunity cost of time with the escalating direct costs of modern life housing, university education, healthcare, and the rational actor sits down, does a cost-benefit analysis,
damage minimal,
which is huge.
Wow. It turns the living room into a war room.
It's a highly sanitized method.
I mean, I understand the logic, but it just feels incredibly hard. If I play devil's advocate and assume that this model is universally true, that it all just boils down to the financial cost of the consumer durable, then we should see a very specific pattern in the real world.
Right. We should see wealth driving fertility.
We would expect the wealthiest societies, especially those with massive social safety nets that subsidize all these costs, to have the highest fertility.
If the state is making debt for refrigerators, people should be acquiring more refrigerators.
Exactly my point. But that model completely disintegrates when you actually look at the global data. We see what is fundamentally a wealth paradox.
The Nordic states are a perfect example of this.
Wealthier societies with massive cradle-to-grave safety nets are consistently trending towards sub-replacement fertility. And if you look at the urban centers with the absolute highest GDP per capita on the planet, they suffer the most dramatic demographic collapses. So how does the economic model account for that?
Well, it struggles to account for it, which is the glaring flaw in the whole rational actor theory. Yet, despite the data staring them right in the face, governments keep doubling down on this exact framework.
They just keep throwing money at it.
It's an incredible phenomenon of policy stubbornness. We see this across the globe, particularly in places like South Korea, Japan, and Singapore.
Places staring down a terrifying demographic winter.
Exactly. And their response is to deploy multi-billion-dollar economic campaigns. We are talking about literal cash baby bonuses deposited directly into your bank account upon birth.
Just flat out cash.
Massive tax credits, heavily subsidized housing specifically reserved for newlyweds, state-sponsored childcare, you name it.
And it's not working, is it?
No, these interventions are failing spectacularly. Year after year, despite billions poured into the system, the fertility rates drop even further. And the reason they fail is that they completely misunderstand human motivation.
Because cash transfers don't create the desire for a family.
They do not and cannot create that initial spark. They only subsidize a decision that a fully formed, committed couple has already made.
Assuming the couple already exists. Hey, what if the couple just doesn't exist?
That is the crux of the issue. The entire Beckerian model assumes that the fundamental unit of demographic continuity is an isolated individual sitting alone in a room, running a spreadsheet.
Just doing a cost-benefit analysis.
But that is not how sociology works.
And this isn't just any apartment. It is a highly subsidized housing unit provided specifically by the South Korean government, built with the explicit goal of incentivizing young people to marry and start families.
So it got the space sorted.
Exactly. The air in the flat still has that sharp, sterile smell of fresh paint and cheap synthetic adhesive. On paper, Min-jun is a complete policy success story.
He ticks all the boxes.
He qualifies for the housing, he's eligible for the childbirth stipends, he has a stable corporate job. The state has systematically removed the economic obstacles, yet the apartment is dead quiet.
Because the state solved the spatial problem, but completely ignored the psychological reality.
Exactly. 3 months ago, Min-jun's fiance walked out.
Yeah.
But she didn't leave because they couldn't afford the rent or because of future school tuition. She left because the emotional labor of maintaining the relationship was impossible.
The stress got to them.
Both of them were working these grueling 10-hour shifts, staring at corporate monitors, just absorbing the ambient stress of a hyper-competitive society.
All right, you bring all that home with you.
Yeah. By the time they returned to that pristine, state-subsidized apartment, the basic act of listening to another human being's anxieties, of bearing each other's emotional weight, it felt like an insurmountable chore.
The friction of intimacy was just too much.
So now Min-jun is sitting on the floor, tracing a coffee stain where her bags used to sit.
Mm-hmm.
Next to him is this glossy, useless government brochure detailing the financial bonuses for a second child.
Breaking.
He is completely emotionally depleted. He's sitting in a state-sponsored vacuum where no amount of one can buy back the emotional stamina required to truly love someone.
The tragedy there is that economic models don't even have a vocabulary for what he is experiencing. Economists can measure disposable income, sure, but they cannot measure emotional depletion. The state provided the drywall and the plumbing, but it cannot mandate psychological resilience.
It makes me think of an analogy. It's like the government is trying to solve the demographic collapse by putting premium high-octane gasoline into a car that has no engine.
Oh, that's a perfect way to look at it.
They are standing in a pump, flooding the tank with all this financial fuel, baffled as to why the vehicle isn't moving.
Meanwhile, the gas is just spilling onto the concrete.
If the foundational mechanism, the engine of intimate covenantal bonding between two people, is missing or rusted out, nothing is going to move forward.
The car just sits there.
Which really makes me question the fundamental premise here. Did economics ever truly drive fertility rates? Or have we just been imposing this retroactive financial narrative onto something we never fully understood?
Question. And to answer it, we have to dig into the historical precedent. The surprising truth is that historically, economics did play a massive role in driving fertility rates down.
Really?
Yes. but the underlying mechanics were entirely different from what we see today. If we look back at the Victorian demographic transition in England around the mid to late 19th century, we see massive drops in fertility.
Okay, so the birth rate plummeted.
It did. And it was intrinsically tied to socioeconomic adjustments. But it wasn't because people suddenly became rational actors worried about the cost of a pram. It was driven by a monumental shift in public health.
Oh, you mean the era when cities finally started building proper sanitation infrastructure?
Exactly.
The massive sewer projects in London, cleaning up the water supply?
Yes. During the 1860s and 1870s, England experienced a steep decline in child mortality.
Amazing.
Prior to this, the brutal reality of human existence was that a significant percentage of children simply did not survive to see their 5th birthday.
Right, so people had to have a lot of kids just to ensure a few survived.
Exactly. Natural fecundity wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was a desperate biological strategy to ensure 2 or 3 children reached adulthood to provide agricultural or economic support.
But suddenly, public health improves, and the probability of a child dying plummets. But logically, if more children are surviving, shouldn't that have led to a massive population explosion? Why did the birth rate fall?
Well, it did lead to a boom initially, but it quickly created a severe structural problem for families. Previously, a family might have 8 births to achieve 3 surviving adults. Now they were having 8 births and seeing 7 or 8 children survive.
Wow, that's a huge strain on resources.
Suddenly, food, space, and inheritance were stretched incredibly thin. Furthermore, this period coincided with early industrialization,
where brute agricultural labor was being replaced by specialized skills.
Quickly, families faced what historical economists call a quantity-quality trade-off. To invest in the quality of their children, to ensure they were educated enough to survive in this new economy, families realized they had to actively limit the quantity.
They had to hit a smaller desired family size,
which meant they had to start actively adopting contraception.
Okay, this is where the historical reality gets so fascinating, because the word contraception means something entirely different to us today than it did to a Victorian family.
Completely different.
Today, regulating fertility is incredibly low friction. It's a quick trip to the pharmacy, a discreet doctor's appointment. But in the 19th century, making the active decision to limit your fertility carried massive fixed costs.
Staggering fixed costs. And we are talking about financial costs. We are talking about intense societal friction.
Social opposition.
Huge opposition. The medical profession at the time was deeply skeptical of birth control, often labeling it as dangerous folk medicine.
And the church, I imagine, was not on board.
Fiercely opposed. Clergy across both Protestant and Catholic denominations vocally opposed any interference with natural reproduction. If a married couple wanted to limit their fertility, they were committing an act of profound social deviance.
So they faced alienation, moral condemnation,
intense social opprobrium.
And there was also a literal danger in just seeking out the information, right? You couldn't just Google it.
The informational barriers were severe. The general public genuinely did not understand the complex biology of procreation.
And the state actively suppressed it.
To give you a historical anchor, consider Charles Knowlton's book, The Fruits of Philosophy.
Okay.
It was a relatively straightforward text discussing basic methods of birth control. When it was republished in England in the 1870s, it caused a massive scandal.
Wait, just for printing information?
Yes. The publishers, Charles Bradlaugh and Andy Besant, were actually arrested and indicted for distributing obscene material.
Wow.
They were put on trial simply for printing information on how a family might limit their size.
So the act of adopting contraception was fraught with extreme social and legal peril.
It was a huge risk.
Choosing to have fewer children wasn't a casual lifestyle choice. It was an act of open social rebellion. So who actually took on that risk?
How did the birth rate eventually drop if the barriers were so high?
The shift was driven by the early adopters, who, in this context, were the wealthy elites.
The rich could afford the social cost.
Exactly. Richer households enjoyed a high total utility and life status, wealth, comfort, so they were less devastated by the social censure from the church. They were willing to pay the high fixed costs of social rebellion.
Yes, specifically so they could invest heavily in the quality and education of a smaller number of heirs. They broke the taboo.
And then it trickled down.
Decades. As these smaller, highly educated families became the aspirational norm, the social stigma relaxed, and the methods diffused down through the middle and working classes.
When you lay out the mechanics of the Victorian transition, the contrast with our modern world is absolutely jarring. It feels like the entire dynamic has been completely inverted. Well, in the 19th century, the foundational desire for a covenantal bond for a family unit was completely intact. Couples were firmly established. To go back to our earlier analogy, the engine of the car was running perfectly and they were driving down the road.
Right, they just needed to step on the brakes to prevent overshooting their target family size.
Exactly. And to step on those brakes, they willingly absorbed massive social and legal friction. Today, we have perfected the technology of the brakes. The variable costs and social stigma are practically zero.
Contraception is cheap and ubiquitous.
But the fundamental desire to establish the baseline partnership, to even get into the car, put the key in the ignition, and start the engine has completely evaporated.
That is the profound historical irony we are living through. The Victorians had the drive to build families, but lacked the frictionless technology to limit them. Modern society has the frictionless technology, but we have lost the psychological capacity to produce the families.
So, if the physical environment, financial means, and the availability of contraception are the primary barriers stopping people from forming intimate bonds today, how do we definitively prove that?
We need to look at how humans actually behave when the physical and financial variables are altered.
Right. And to do that, I want to look at a stark structural paradox between two major modern European nations, Italy and Germany.
This is a fascinating comparison.
Both of these countries are locked in the exact same demographic range. They both suffer from chronically low sub-replacement fertility rates. Yet the physical and domestic arrangements of their young adult populations are polar opposites.
The contrast is one of the most illuminating paradoxes in modern sociology. Let's look at Italy first. The situation for young adults in Italy is characterized by a severe spatial and economic bottleneck. Currently, only about 10% of young Italian adults live as couples in independent households.
10%?
The vast majority are caught in a cultural and economic phenomenon known as the bamboccioni.
The bamboccioni.
Right. It's a somewhat derogatory term for adults who remain trapped in a state of extended adolescence, living in their childhood bedrooms deep into their late 20s and off to their 30s.
And this isn't because Italians just love living with their parents forever. It's driven by brutal macroeconomic realities.
Exactly. It is a forced dependency. It's driven by chronically high youth unemployment, rigid labor markets that protect older workers at the expense of new entrants, and a cultural expectation that you don't leave home until you have permanent financial security.
Which is increasingly impossible to find. So when you look at the Italian data, the barrier to couple formation seems incredibly obvious. It's almost purely physical and spatial.
Right, you don't have the space.
You cannot exactly start a vibrant romantic life, let alone build a family, if you and your partner are both sleeping in twin beds down the hall from your parents. The bottleneck appears to be the sheer lack of a shared roof.
It looks like a pure housing and economic crisis.
But then you turn your attention northward to Germany, and that entire physical argument just collapses.
Germany represents the exact inverse of the Italian spatial crisis. The macroeconomic environment for young people there is vastly different. Roughly 1/3 of young adults live as independent cohabiting couples. They benefit from a strong economy that allows for early residential independence.
So they have stable jobs,
stable employment prospects, high geographic mobility, and a rental market that is accessible enough that young couples can secure their own apartments.
They have the physical space, they have the financial means, they have escaped the childhood bedroom.
They have exactly what the Italians are missing.
And yet the cradles in Germany are still empty. Their fertility rate is just as depressed.
Which is the crux of the paradox. If a lack of housing and financial stability were the true bottlenecks, Germany's birth rate should be exponentially higher than Italy's.
It should be a demographic powerhouse.
But it isn't. The rates are incredibly similar. This proves definitively that physically bringing two people together inside an independent apartment does not generate a family if the underlying psychological commitment is missing.
It shatters the spatial argument completely. You can give people the apartment, you can give them the jobs, but you cannot force them to merge their lives.
To understand why physical proximity fails to translate to families, we have to look through the lens of sociology, specifically the work of Zygmunt Bauman and his concept of liquid modernity.
Liquid modernity.
Bauman argued that in contemporary, hypermodern societies like Germany, social forms and institutions no longer hold their shape for long.
Like they've melted.
Yes. In a solid modernity, institutions like marriage and career were heavy, permanent, and provided a stable foundation. But in liquid modernity, everything is fluid. It's constantly shifting. designed to flow around obstacles rather than confront them.
Relationships.
In places like Germany, the act of cohabitation has been completely decoupled from the idea of a lifelong, solid covenant.
So moving in together is no longer a stepping stone to permanent commitment.
No, it has become something else entirely. It is a highly flexible, easily dissolvable, provisional contract.
Provisional.
Two people move in together not to build a permanent foundation, but to maximize individual self-actualization, share expenses, and enjoy companionship while deliberately minimizing any long-term liability.
They keep the relationship fluid.
So if the emotional current changes or a better job arises in another city, the bond can be dissolved with minimal friction.
It's like modern cohabitation has mutated into an alliance of convenience. It honestly reminds me of two people deciding to share a premium streaming subscription or splitting rent just to afford a nicer neighborhood. Yes, they're physically occupying the same space, they share a kitchen, they might deeply care for one another, and they look like a traditional couple from the outside. But internally, they maintain entirely separate psychological horizons.
They keep their finances separate.
Their career trajectories remain completely sovereign, and crucially, they keep their exit strategies perfectly intact.
Always having a way.
Right. If you compare the two nations, in Italy, the child remains unborn because there is no shared roof to house them. But in Germany, the child remains unborn because there is no shared destiny to anchor them.
No shared destiny. That captures the psychological reality perfectly. The fundamental structure of a relationship in liquid modernity is inherently defensive.
Because a child is the ultimate permanent commitment.
You cannot bring a child into a provisional arrangement without fundamentally shattering that provisionality. A child requires absolute solidity.
Which naturally leads to the most important question. Why has this specific brand of liquid modernity taken root so aggressively in the last 15 or 20 years? What is causing this profound fear of shared destiny?
Because if you look back, people always faced economic uncertainty, but they still married.
Right. They faced wars and recessions, but they still took that leap of faith. What changed the psychological environment so drastically that we became terrified of permanent bonds?
To find the catalyst, we have to look closely at the technological infrastructure that has enveloped humanity over the last 15 years.
Technology.
There's a staggering, undeniable correlation hidden in the data. The global declines in fertility map almost perfectly onto the rollout of 4G networks and the ubiquitous adoption of smartphones.
And that's that perfectly.
Incredible. Research synthesized in publications like Logos Press points out a fascinating timeline. If you look at the sharpest drop-offs in fertility, they occur in a staggered, region-specific pattern.
Okay, staggered half.
In the US, the UK, and Australia, the fertility floor falls out sharply right around 2007.
Okay.
In France and Poland, the drop doesn't accelerate until close to 2009. And in emerging economies like Mexico and Indonesia, the plummet occurs post-2012.
Okay, let me stop you there because those staggered dates are incredibly telling. If someone were trying to blame the modern fertility collapse on the 2008 global financial crisis, the timeline would make sense.
The recession was a global shock. It hit everywhere roughly at the same time.
But you're saying France held steady until 2009, and Indonesia didn't drop until 2012. What specific event links those exact localized years?
It wasn't a financial event. Those years, 2007, 2009, 2012, track the exact years when high-speed mobile internet, specifically 3G and 4G networks, combined with market saturation of smartphones, hit those regions. 2007 was the release of the iPhone in the US. By 2009, the network infrastructure reached critical mass in Europe. By 2012, affordable smartphones hits in Mexico and Indonesia.
We are not tracking a financial recession. We are tracking a profound neurological rewiring. The moment the internet moved from the desktop computer directly into our pockets, constantly attached to our bodies, everything changed.
It is backed by hard neuroscience.
What are the neuroscientists saying?
Researchers like Michael Platt and Peter Sterling have pointed to what they term an epidemic of despair. Their research demonstrates that infinite digital screen time has aggressively replaced real-world, high-friction socializing.
Which is what our brains are wired for.
For hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain evolved to receive its primary dopamine rewards from deep physical social bonds. Eye contact, touch, reading microexpressions.
Navigating complex social hierarchies in person.
But the smartphone hijacks that reward system. This massive digital substitution is causing a catastrophic rise in baseline anxiety, severe social isolation, and a measurable chemical drop in the neural rewards we get from being around other people.
It creates a paradox that I honestly find terrifying. Digital hyperconnectivity is acting as the ultimate incubator for unprecedented loneliness. We have voluntarily traded the messy, unpredictable friction of physical community for frictionless, perfectly curated digital proxies.
It's a sanitized existence.
Let me paint a picture of what this actually looks like on an individual level. Think about Clara. She lives in San Francisco, at the absolute epicenter of this digital abundance and technological wealth.
Okay.
From the moment she wakes up, her phone buzzes with a relentless, perfectly optimized stream of notifications. She has Slack messages from her remote team, algorithmic matches on 3 different dating apps, and automated updates from a food delivery service tracking her dinner to the exact minute.
She's hyperconnected.
Completely. Financially, Clara earns more at age 28 than both of her parents did combined at the peak of their careers. Yet her physical existence is entirely sanitized of human touch.
Starved of physical reality.
Yes. One rainy Tuesday evening, Clara suddenly realizes she hasn't actually looked another human being in the eye for 4 days.
Yes, Commander.
Her groceries are left silently at her doorstep. Her intense work meetings are reduced to floating avatars on the screen.
That is deeply isolating.
So, to drown out the heavy, suffocating silence of her expensive apartment, she opens a streaming app and leaves a podcast of ambient cafe chatter playing on a loop.
Really? Just ambient noise.
Just the sound of clinking cups and muffled laughter. It is a desperate synthetic substitute for the sound of human breath.
Wow.
Later that evening, she opens her door to grab a package. As the delivery courier hands it over, his fingers accidentally brush against hers. It's a microsecond of unexpected physical contact.
And how did she react?
In that instant, a violent, involuntary surge of panic, mixed with an overwhelming, agonizing longing, hits her chest. She quickly shuts the door, locks it, and presses her back against the wood, hot tears of embarrassment stinging her eyes.
Action. This is so much.
The digital world promised her total autonomy, complete control, and infinite connection. But the reality of that accidental touch reveals a terrifying truth. She is completely, functionally alone while trapped inside a hyper-connected network.
Clara's story is deeply unsettling because it is no longer an anomaly. It is the statistical norm for an entire generation. What she is experiencing is the absolute starvation of human connection in the midst of overwhelming digital gluttony.
Digital gluttony.
If we analyze the sociology behind this, we are looking at the final stages of the death of the third place.
The third place.
Historically, humans forged bonds in high-friction physical environments. Pubs, civic clubs, bowling alleys, community centers. Spaces distinct from home and work.
Places where you just had to interact with people.
Yes. In a third place, you had to navigate unpredictable social cues. You had to handle rejection gracefully, tolerate boredom, and build psychological resilience interacting with people you didn't perfectly align with.
But those places are disappearing.
As they've been dismantled or abandoned for screens, the entire process of intimacy has been forced into the digital realm.
And when intimacy is forced onto the screen, it immediately becomes gamified. It stops being a human interaction and becomes a user interface.
That is the core danger. The gamification of intimacy, specifically on dating apps, has engineered a psychological environment of profound isolation. You are no longer meeting a person in a complex social context.
You're just looking at a disembodied scroll of faces.
Yes, which triggers the paradox of choice. When confronted with infinite options, the human brain freezes. Instead of committing to the flawed, real person across from you, your brain is calculating the opportunity cost, wondering if an algorithmically superior match is just one swipe away.
It completely atrophies your psychological stamina. When an entire generation's developmental window, those crucial teens and 20s, is spent behind the safety of a screen, carefully curating their image and instantly swiping away any friction, their ability to endure real interpersonal friction disappears.
Real relationships are messy. They're frequently boring. They involve intense conflict and miscommunication.
But if your brain is neurologically trained to just close the app, block the user, or ghost the conversation the exact second you feel discomfort, you permanently lose the capacity to sustain and bond.
That loss of capacity is the critical bottleneck we have been searching for. Because when dating is moved onto apps and conflict resolution skills wither away, Mate selection mutates into something unrecognizable.
You are no longer seeking a partner, you are seeking to optimize a human asset.
Yes.
This shift fundamentally alters the architecture of relationships. If we look at how partnerships evolved over the centuries, we've moved through distinct phases to arrive at this point of optimization.
Historically, we moved through 3 phases. First was the covenantal model.
Okay, what was that based on?
It was the bedrock of human society for centuries.
Acknowledge.
Deeply rooted in duty, economic interdependence, and intergenerational continuity. You're married to build a family unit, ensure mutual survival, and pass something tangible.
A solid foundation.
Then, in the mid-20th century, we shifted to the therapeutic or expressive model.
What changed?
Wealth increased, survival became less precarious, the purpose of marriage became primarily about personal growth, discovering your authentic self, and achieving emotional fulfillment.
That sounds like the romantic ideal most of us grew up watching in movies. But that isn't where we are today, is it?
No, we have moved past the therapeutic model. Today, we are firmly entrenched in the transactional or liquid model. It is a deeply defensive, highly